transition a little bit into it. Transition into what we want to do. We want to think a little bit about today in the upcoming 55 minutes. Think about why interventions fail. So think a little bit about why sometimes we have really good intentions. We approach people, we want to help them, and they backfire. Sometimes interventions make things worse. So attempting to help somebody sometimes makes the helper, the person that is helped, the recipient of our help, feel worse. And sometimes motivation decreases rather than increases. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about the reasons behind that. If we would have a little bit more time, then I would start, as I usually start my session on this topic, by asking you to imagine that you would be hired to increase the performance of the psychology department in the illusionary Biddy University. So here I would task you with trying to figure out, okay, the lecturers, the staff, they could perform a little bit better, we have the feeling. They could be a little bit more motivated. They do certain things that they don't want to do, but they should do it more often. They should prepare more for their lectures. They might try to get more feedback integrated better into their teaching. And this would increase maybe student satisfaction and student achievements. So now it's like, imagine that you have to kind of, your task is it to increase my motivation to give a better lecture, right? How could you do that? There are different variations. Sometimes I also teach like an introductory course on psychology to business school students in Mumbai during the summer. And we have a different example here, but the answers were of course like, okay, imagine that you have to have like in a management context, right? You have to kind of address middle management people who are kind of in the middle of their career. How could you increase their motivation? And I think when we do this with students, when I do this with students, and I did this in Korea, I did this in India, I did it in US, I do it in Germany, I did it with you guys last year in our online sessions when they were a little bit longer. What I ask is often what people say, like the first thing, and a lot of things are variations on increasing pay, making putting incentives in place that if I reach a certain satisfaction, for instance, then I get some kind of monetary rewards. Sometimes I think some students suggest, oh, if you reach a certain student satisfaction, then maybe you get an iPad or a better computer, you get a prize, you get an award, you get recognition, and so forth. Okay, and it seems like that there's a specific kind of idea behind what would motivate me. That is like, if I just give you a little bit more money, or if I give you monetary incentives, then you would, my performance would increase. And I often say like, okay, this is like what I then often give back to the students is like, you would have to offer me quite substantial amount of money to actually make a perceptible difference in my life, right? If I would have 20,000 less or more in a year, I don't know, this wouldn't really make any difference to my life. Now you can imagine that if you have to do it for 40 members of the department, even if you think that money is a real good way to motivate people, that gets extremely expensive extremely fast. So maybe there are other ways to think about money, but I also want to kind of highlight here that we often think that certain things motivate people, that certain things are very helpful for people, that helping is helpful for people. And in the first section, I want to kind of highlight a little bit that this often is a false assumption, that money can often backfire, that helping can backfire, and other attempts to kind of improve the lives of other people can actually backfire. So let me share my screen and kind of walk you in the first section a little bit about the things when interventions fail. And then we want to think a little bit about why these interventions might potentially fail. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this kind of like, what could you do at Biddy University, and then we can kind of see, maybe you thought a little bit about what you do. You can kind of maybe write something a little bit down and then see, okay, would that actually be helpful? So this is basically the first section, is how not to motivate people. So motivation and incentives often come into play, especially if we want people to do something that they would not do on their own, or that they don't want to do. Right? So here's some classic example. So the idea often is like you start out is that we think like, oh, it's kind of like the carrot and sticks, right? Rewards and punishment. So what in order to get Andreas to work more, to maybe make his slides even better, I'm not sure if that's possible, but let's assume that would be possible, or it's his teaching, or to make him a little bit more motivated, interested, passionate, etc. What we have to do is we have to tangle some kind of carrot in front of him, and if he doesn't do it, some kind of stick, right? This is often the assumption people have on how to motivate people, often originating out of economic ideas. So here are two studies that kind of highlight the problem with that. So on the left, this is a study by Frey and Oberholzer G. And what they did in this study is they looked at people, this is like a real observation, but there was in a canton, like a department, a part of Switzerland, they had, and as part of Switzerland, they want to put a nuclear waste site. They said like, okay, we need to put our nuclear waste somewhere, and we need to put it in one of our regions, and we need to convince the people that this would be okay. They should give, or they should agree that we can put the nuclear waste site in their neighborhood, right? So you can imagine people don't want to live even in a close proximity to any kind of nuclear waste. So it's not something that's very popular. And basically, they tried two different approaches in the study to try to change the attitudes. And one, they would basically kind of like would not offer any incentive to actually they would not offer participants or like the people that are living there any incentives. They would just say, okay, how willing would you be to accept a nuclear waste site here? We have to put it somewhere. They would explain the rationale, and then would ask him how willing they would be to do so. Perfectly fine. My wife is in the background. Providing additional entertainment. So this is one where they wouldn't provide anything. In the other condition, they offered substantial amounts of money. So they would, for instance, say, would you be more willing to accept the nuclear waste site if we offer you 10,000, I don't know what their francs or whatever they have there, this is Swiss money. So they would offer them substantial amounts of money. But what you can see, the moment the researchers offered money in exchange for allowing people to have this nuclear waste site in their neighborhood, the willingness to accept that nuclear waste site actually went down. Okay, so it got worse. People were less willing to have it. So offering no incentive was more effective than trying to motivate people to get that nuclear waste site by giving them, for instance, 10,000. I think it's francs. It's probably not francs. Whatever it is in Switzerland. Please put it in a chat if you know what the currency in Switzerland is. I think that is not super critical to understand that study, but it would be nice to know. And there's another study here on the right by Gnisi and Rustinici. And here what they do is basically they looked at people who volunteered and went from door to door. And these were 16 to 18-year-old pupils, high school students, and they looked at how much effort they put into their volunteering activities and how much money they actually brought in, right? So in one condition, the students did it on their own. In the other condition, they got a little bit paid. So they would have, for instance, here an equivalent in today's money, I would have paid you £10 to do so. And what they find is that the students who volunteered without any monetary incentive did much better, so they went to more doors and got more money than those who were offered money in exchange. Okay, so we have like two here kind of examples where basically offering people to motivate them something makes it worse. Okay. There's a famous study, I think I just want to, by now probably everybody knows that there's another study in the same paper by Gnisi and Rustinici, where it's often called the Israel kindergarten study. But here what the kindergarten wanted to do is they wanted to decrease the likelihood that parents pick up their children late. really annoying if you work in a daycare in a school setting and it's like 5 or 6 and some parents come late, so the staff has to stay, we have to keep the facilities open and to wait that the person is picking up their child. So here what they did is like everyone who comes 5 minutes late has to pay a certain amount of I think shekel, that is the Israeli currency, I hope. And so, and if you come 10, you have to pay more, and in 15, you have to pay more. So here, instead of carrots, they want to have a stick, right? And what happens is that this kind of led to a drastic increase of parents coming late, right? Now it's almost like you're just like, well, if you come late, you just pay a little fee, and it's okay. So this is another example where people try to motivate people by monetary carrots and sticks to do a behavior, and it backfired. So here, offering penalties or establishing penalties made the behavior worse rather than lessened its occurrence. There's another study where it's kind of like if you kind of into a more organizational psychology, one of the conundrums of organizational psychology is actually how dissatisfied people often are with their jobs, right? I think for me this is hard to imagine. I love my job. There's certain aspects I do not like about my job, but I'm very satisfied. I think yesterday I chatted with my wife and we were thinking if we would don't ask why, but if we would get an amount of 4 million pounds, would we stop working or not? And I felt like I wouldn't stop working. I would still, even if I didn't have to, I would keep on working. But most people here, you can see on the left is that most people, and this is like in one study, you basically have only one person out of in 10 is really satisfied with their job. So I think last week we talked a little bit about there's like jobs are essential for our mental health. I think a lot of people suffer tremendously from depression, suicide, anxiety if they're out of jobs, if they do not have a job. But having a job, often people become very quickly dissatisfied, and often in high-paying jobs. On the right, you can see this is like if I ask people to give up some of their life earnings, okay? Can you give up like 10-15% of the money you would earn over your whole lifetime in order to have a job that would provide you with more meaning? 9 out of 10 people would do so. Okay, so here it seems like if I am dealing with a certain clientele, if I'm dealing, for instance, in organizational psychology with people who already have a substantial or like a sufficient amount of money, it seems like that we quickly run out of increases in motivation if we would use monetary incentives. People, their dissatisfaction with their jobs and their lack of motivation and commitment is often not, or at least very loosely tied to the money they earn. There's another, I think is there's like 2 more examples that I want to kind of highlight here. One of the kind of interesting trends in mental health, I think, over the last years is that there's a rise in teenage suicides, right? So teenage and young adult mental health is at least as long as we as measure in an all-time low. So you guys are more anxious, are more stressed, are more depressed than I was when I went to university. And people don't really understand why, if you come from a very kind of resource-oriented way of thinking about it, because the resources you have, the technology, the quality of the teaching, etc., is much, much higher than when I was at university. Our professors basically very rarely give a damn about their teaching. There was very little incentives in place to increase the quality of the teaching, and we were often left to our own devices, etc. But yes, we were less stressed. So there's something where it's like, okay, why do teenagers, for instance, who do materialistically better than ever in history of humankind, right? So they're like basically at the summit of the fulfillment of materialistic values, yet the suicide rate is on the rise. Again, here seems to be like just giving people money and house and an iPad, etc. doesn't seem to work in order to make them happy and fulfilled. There's a last kind of conundrum we want to look at, and this is basically that one of the key problems in a lot of interventions is that the effectiveness of interventions falls for teenagers. So a lot of interventions kind of work relatively well. So here you can see this is for bullying interventions on the y-axis, and the D is basically the effect size. How positive is the effect of the intervention on whatever dependent variable you're measuring it, some kind of indicator of bullying, right? And you can see that in the first grade, the effect is kind of, it's a medium, small to medium effect that the intervention had. So it seems like it has a positive effect on decreasing bullying. But then you can see basically around 7th to 8th grade. So around in the UK, that would be around 12. It kind of decreases and then it backfires, right? So here interventions attempts to trying to teach teenagers about bullying. Here the same you have with interventions of obesity and depression. It's the same pattern. So within basically the intervention participants, once they're teenagers, often these interventions backfire or at least lose their effectiveness, okay? So it seems like there's an approach that works really well for children, but then I talk to teenagers, and then these teenagers are like, oh, I don't know, like this seems to backfire. It seems to actually increase bullying. Imagine that you're designing an intervention, right? And you're going into school, and then it turns out that your intervention increased even to the same degree others like increased the incidence of bullying. Okay, so these are kind of like the conundrums that I want to put out before I want to explain it. I would like to ask you guys, okay, forgot one. And maybe we can start this. Here's a study. So we have basically right now, sometimes carrots and sticks, especially in terms of money, seem to backfire. So offering people money to do something doesn't seem to help. Offering young people money to do a job is often worse than not offering them any money. It seems like that interventions for teenagers do not do well. It seems like that in organizational psychology, employees who have a lot of money would rather give up money in order to get something else back. They're not really satisfied even though they earn a lot of money. And then we had like teenagers, the effectiveness of teenage interventions kind of decreases, right, from age on. So the older we get, the less susceptible we are. And in the terms of here in the meta-analysis or review that I showed you, you can see that actually some interventions get worse. They make the problem worse. It seems like the same intervention that helped students with or pupils at the age of 10 made it worse for the age of 14. The last study I want to kind of highlight here is a study by Neil Bolger and colleagues. And it's like actually they ask the question kind of, does helping help? It sounds kind of weird, right? But we assume that basically if I meet you and I offer my help to you, that this will have a positive impact on your well-being. But there's actually a surprisingly large amount of research on the topic where helping does not help. Okay, so this is basically kind of like showing that, okay, sometimes helping another person actually makes it worse. So this is here in the study. These are what Neil Bolger and colleagues did. They studied couples. And the couples will do a bar exam. So we're in the US. These are all students or couples where one of the partners, where one of the people in the couple finished their law school. So they had just like 3 years of law school, really stressful time. What you have to do then in order to practice in the US, they have to take a bar exam. The bar exam basically gives you the legal permission to practice right in this area. It's a very stressful thing. It's often another kind of hard exam that you have to take. You have to be really well versed with the local laws in the certain state. And only if you get that, then you can practice law. And the quicker you get it, the more easy or the earlier you can repay all the debt you have from your law school and start earning money. Very stressful time. Often couples break up during that time. So what they looked here is basically what is the effect of providing emotional help from the partner. So here they define this, they would ask him, did you listen to or comforted the examinee within the previous 24 hours? And they want to know, if you helped me yesterday emotionally, if you listened to me, if you said like, Andreas, you can do it, relax, you got this, how do I feel on the next day? Okay? And this is like, I think I just like, let's just focus on the right here. So the key point is that I want to just highlight here is that often provision makes people actually makes the person who who is the recipient of this help feel worse. Okay, so I want to just kind of highlight one line here, and I show you another graphic. But this is basically the provision of help significantly increased the depression levels of that person on the next day. So if you would have helped me, if you would have listened to me, if you would have kind of comforted me, on the next day, I would feel worse. Okay, here's a different way to kind of looking at this. Oh, I should not have drawn about it. It's like support provision. Okay, and this is basically, you can ignore these like two lines. There's like this large manufactic you can see here, and it's basically both like providing help in this kind of listening and comforting way, right? Where we think like it's a really good thing. I did it. It had a negative impact on depression from today or to the next day. So there's a change in depression, a negative change in depression. Okay. So here helping did not help. Okay. So just saying like, oh, and then we have to listen to people, etc. Why does it not help, right? And maybe I would love to pause a moment here. I would ask you guys, okay, for any of these problems, why money sometimes doesn't help, why teenagers, the effects of interventions on teenagers decrease, why helping does not help. Do you guys have any like suggestions why this would be the case? You could put it in a chat. You can also unmute yourself and let me know, or just talk to me and talk to us. And I would love to hear your opinions or your ideas. Why do you think that sometimes helping with certain ways does not help? What could be the problems? Do you have any kind of suggestions, intuitions about this? All right, Lara, please.
I was thinking the last one where you said if you help them the day before, they feel worse the day after. It might be that getting comforted the day before and then not having any comfort the day after, it kind of makes it worse in comparison.
Okay, so you're almost like, I think, is it fair to say it's almost, okay, so like you're a little bit dependent on that help? I can only feel well if I receive. Okay, that's an interesting idea. So there is something about where I basically now depend on your help for my own well-being. Is that kind of like a fair way to describe what you had in mind?
Yeah.
Okay, very interesting idea. Okay, Vida put something in the chat. Let me have a look. Yeah, okay, so it could be, right, that like, I mean, last year somebody also said, when we talked about this, so Vida in the chat said, makes you aware of the problem, brings it to the front, so now it's on your mind, right? So it could be that if somebody tries to help you, I think then you might feel like, oh, maybe I actually look really stressed. And now that stresses me out. Or it seems like I'm actually not doing very well. That's why I get kind of help offered, right? It's kind of like the attempt to help me indicates me something about myself, but also about the problem. It might make it more aware, right? I could say like, oh man, like, I don't know, January the 17th, you have to submit your coursework. Oh, this will be tough, right? So this could also be like when you're like, oh, I didn't know, I thought we were all good, right? So yes, I think there's a really a real interesting other suggestion. It also kind of puts a little bit of pressure on you. I think parents might help you in a way. It's like, we always helped you. We drive you there. We provide you with that. We paid for your law school. We just paid $200,000 or even more to get you through law school. You better. So there's something where it's like it puts pressure on your expectation. Helping kind of is something. Okay, so I think another one, Natalia, has something, I think if I understand that correctly, where it's like, maybe that the helping is just not good. It might be just kind of like, it's just superficial, right? The person who helps is just like, oh, Natalia doesn't feel very good. Hey, cheer up, right? And you're just like, well, that was not very helpful, right? So the attempt of helping could just not be very good, right? Sometimes might also, last year somebody said like it could be a little bit yes, like condescending, it might trigger like a defensive mechanism. So I come back to that. I think I talked about this already in the seminars, not in all of them, but I was a terrible teenager, right? I was really kind of reactant, and I think this is a little bit what Ilaria says in the chat, right? Might it trigger a defensive mechanism? I remember very, very vividly one example where I was sitting and preparing for a test, the French test. I was about to prepare for a French test for the next day. So I was sitting there and trying, I think I should go through some of the vocabulary in order to be better prepared for my test tomorrow. And in that moment, my mother came in and said, Andreas, I think you should prepare for your French test tomorrow. Why don't you go through some of your vocabulary or the new vocabulary words? And thereafter, I could not bring myself to study. I was like, no, I will not do it, right? And it's like a defensive mechanism. And then we come later on, it's like basically to kind of ward off external control and feel in control of myself. I was so stupid that I could not really overcome that, right? I could not overcome this defensive mechanism, okay? So very good suggestions. Let's see what kind of like the literature has to say, why some of these things backfire. And I think the key here is a little bit that the way we, and this is the first section, the second section we talk a little bit more complex about needs, and the next section is like incentives indicate meaning. Okay, if I give you a certain incentive, if I give you something, if I'm trying to help you in a certain way, that tells you something how I perceive you or what I want from you, or it tells you a little bit about how much I want to exert control over you. Right? Because if we do interventions, we often want to change the people in a certain way. We want to control them in a certain way. And people can understand that and react to that. Okay, let's look at first that incentives indicate meaning, right? So this is a classic study. We talked about it in social psychology last year. Let me kind of remind you. And it's a classic study on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. This is by Levert, Green, and Nisbet. And what they did in the 70s of the last century, they went into a kindergarten, a nursery, a daycare. I think the kids were between 3 and 6 years old. And they came in all of these conditions, but they came in and they brought these magic markers, kind of fun markers to play with. And then they established 3 different conditions. In one condition, they let people, or like not people, let kids in the nursery just play with these markers. So they would just play with them, and half an hour later, they would take them away. In the second condition, they would say, hey, if you play half an hour with these markers, then you get a reward. You get a really cool, I think it was like I can only think of the German word, what is it called? Like a certificate, that's it. You get a fancy certificate, it has like a kind of like a superhero thing on it, and it looks really fancy, and you would get it in front of everyone else for playing that. And the children really loved that, they really wanted to have that certificate, and so this was the second condition. You would play 30 minutes with the magic markers, and then you would get the certificate. And the third condition, they gave the certificate, but it was not expected, it was unexpected. So it's like, here are the pens, if you want to, you can play with them. They played with them, and if they played with them, they unexpectedly got this reward, okay? So when you kind of, now critically what they did is like, I think 2 weeks or a month later, they came back with the pens, gave the children the pens, and looked how much do they play now with these pens. And what you can see in these, like here's like the percentage of time spent playing with the markers is on the y-axis. And what you can see here basically is that the students who had this expected reward, where I tell them, if you do this, then I will give you the certificate, right? They played the least. Unexpected and no reward, they played the most. There was no difference between these conditions. And so the key idea here is kind of like one of the studies that kicked off the idea of intrinsic motivation, where basically the reward tells me something about how much fun it is to play with these markers. We only give rewards for things that are not fun. Now the children are like, oh, this is like, I'm doing it because I will get something. So you focus on an external reward for that. and you do not focus on the enjoyment of the task itself. So when you are not paid to do it, you feel like, oh, I don't want to play with the markers now because I don't get anything. I only did it, right? And that's the meaning the kids get out of it. I only get it because I got the reward, right? And so here you can see if you, like in the intrinsic kind of conditions, if you get no reward, you focus on the joy of it. You're just like, oh, I played it because it's fun. Oh, I can play with it again, okay? So we have this tension between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic being a motivation that comes from within, that we are kind of driven, that we enjoy it, and extrinsic would be kind of perceived as a controlling reward. But the key here is that basically incentive signals to me, hey, this is not a fun activity. That's why we need to pay you. And so the kids here at the age of 3 to 6 already kind of made meaning out of the reward. You can think about the same as in the Gnesi studies and the Frey studies about the atomic waste side, right? You can think about it as like, okay, so if I basically do this for free, right? If I would just allow as a sacrifice for my country, we need a waste site, an atomic waste site, and I do this for free, then I do something heroic and intrinsic. I feel good about myself. But if you give me 10,000, we kind of change the meaning of the whole interaction we have. And now I would start to think about, okay, well, you give me 10,000 in order for that nuclear waste site to be in my neighborhood. But it probably decreases my value of my property by more than 10,000. So I want more money or something like that. Suddenly it is an economic exchange, and it is not something that is intrinsically motivated. So here the reward basically changes the meaning of the interaction you have and the action in itself. So I think this is like one thing to think about, is like, if you give people rewards, what do they signal? Another aspect of that is, and I think that is interwoven with that, is one about control versus autonomy, right? And I think that if we give people extrinsic rewards, if we give them money, then we exert control over them. Because like, if you do this, I want you to do this. If you do this, then you will get a reward, right? This is a means to control. So I do this often with my children, right? Like with my son, if he doesn't want to brush his teeth, like, if you don't brush your teeth, then you can't have movie night on Saturday, right? And that's the worst, taking away, so then he brushes it. But he also is really unhappy with me, and he's unhappy with the teeth brushing, because it is that I exerted my control, my access to resources that he doesn't have, and so I'm trying to control him this way, right? And this is kind of part, I think most of you probably have heard it in one way, one context or the other. One of the two key ideas of self-determination theory by DC and Ryan, which is very influential in basically in all areas of applied clinical, non-clinical in psychology. But the idea is like we have these two different forms of motivation, kind of like a controlled motivation, an external motivation, and an autonomous motivation, an internal motivation. So if you think about the example, if I would basically pay you to do volunteering, then this is something that falls in the realm of external motivation. External motivation is often not a very strong motivation. So you do it to get the reward, but you do the minimum amount of effort in order to still get the money, right? If it's in an internal motivation, if I don't pay you money, then you have to find something within you that motivates you. So for instance, it's like, I'm a person who likes this cause, and I want this cause, I want to help this cause, right? So I'm internally motivated. It could also be that you enjoy speaking with people. It's like, I like to meet new people, make new acquaintance, and I like to talk about this topic. I enjoy that. So this is two examples of internal motivation, and internal motivation is much more effective. So now it becomes clear that why the students, or the 16 to 18 years, the pupils in the unpaid condition worked harder, achieved more with the volunteering, because they had to find something within them to drive them to do that. Versus when I pay you, I don't know, just like a small amount of money, you might feel like, well, I do it, but it's like this little money, it can't be that important, otherwise they would pay us more money. So which would be another kind of incentive, make meaning meaning interpretation. It's also something where I'm getting controlled. And so this is then a shift from internal to external motivation, and I become less effective. Right, you can think about this here the same way. It's like, I want you to play with these crayons, hence I give you this reward. Interpret, it's what is now, it's driven by external motivation, right? I do it for the rewards, I'm not doing it for the enjoyment, and hence this decrease in playing time when I don't get the reward. I don't want to go too much into detail about this. This is kind of like a more formal representation of the idea of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, but you basically have kind of like these stages. It's not that there's external or extrinsic motivation and internal. There's you can see basically it goes from red to yellow, and it becomes more internalized. So you can find ways to internalize extrinsic values. So for instance, right, I get paid for my job. So there's an extrinsic value, and I get certain things I have to teach you guys now at this time, and it has to be online. There's a lack of kind of control I have over that, and I get certain incentives if I do so. But I can also connect this with my joy of teaching you, with the importance of these topics, and that kind of taps then into more internal sources. So I can do something that's kind of externally controlled and kind of integrated into my own regulation, and thereby become more internally motivated. So you can see here there's a congruence and awareness synthesis with the self. So if I try to get my externally controlled behavior in line with my internal motives and values, that allows me to basically then be more internally motivated. So this is like one big part of self-determination theory, but here it's like often that we try to, it's better to find, motivate people by connecting this to their internal, to their internal motives and values, rather than using extrinsic values. Okay, the quality of the work is much higher if it's internally motivated than external. Hence, for instance, I always like, do something in your intervention, right, that you really care about. It's much better. You might find like, well, I'm not sure what I care about. That's another issue. But if you find something you're passionate about that you chose freely, that I did not dictate, you have a much stronger experience of autonomy and control, and hence your work will be better. So one study, and I just kind of want to tap into this. Next is kind of like this control versus autonomy, right? And this is basically this striving for autonomy is one of the reasons why this emerges when we become teenagers, when we turn to teenagers, and stays with us. But here this idea is like that the moment we become teenagers, we become really aversive of being controlled by others. So this is a study in a context where they use this kind of this distinction and try to explain why interventions, for instance, about obesity, but also about depression or bullying, as you saw in the beginning of the slides, why do we lack the efficiency? Why do they become so less effective and sometimes even backfire, right? So here they contrast these kind of two different ways of intervention. So in one type of intervention here on the left side, they do the classic thing, okay? They inform the students, the teenagers, okay, it's important to eat healthy, it's important to drink healthy, don't drink your calories, add a little, this is how you build a really healthy meal. So the idea here is that students or like teenagers don't eat well because they don't know how to eat well. And we have to kind of show them how to build a healthy drink. They should say, oh, you know what you should do? You should not drink Coke for lunch, you should drink water, right? And once they see that, then this will kind of, they have an aha, an insight, and they will change their behavior. This is the type of intervention that backfires with teenagers. On the other side, what the researchers did, they kind of said like, okay, what are the key values that teenagers have? And they identified two. We come a little bit later to a third one. But they identified two key values that are really, really strong with teenagers. This is like a real strong sense of autonomy. They don't want to be manipulated, controlled. Think think of me as the teenager trying to prepare for my French class, and my mother comes in and tells me what I should do. My reactance, my defensive mechanism were so strong I couldn't overcome that. So this is one real key attribute here. And then there's another one where it's like it's about social justice. If you kind of look at the movements that kind of in some ways shape our society, they often originate from teenagers. So there's a very strong sense of trying for striving for social justice, for instance, but also for other causes. And this could also be tapped into. Okay, so it's like, okay, we are trying to change teenagers' eating behavior by tapping into their sense of autonomy and their longing for social justice. So what they do is, I don't know why I can't, yes. So I just have, so here you see, like, they presented them with ads like these, right? This is a McDonald's ad where it's like, oh, look, here's our food. It's really wholesome. There's some, all these wonderful ingredients. And if you eat it, right, it's wholesome, have some. And what they show here, this is like on the left, I kind of copy and paste some of the messages that they address to the teenagers. They said like, okay, the message was framed as an expose of manipulative food industry marketing practices, okay? So with the intent, this is how the food industry, the fast food industry gets teenagers and young adults to fall for their food, okay? And so they trick you into, they pay scientists to kind of make the food more addictive. They trick you to eat more food than you actually would have eaten if these addictive additives wouldn't be in there. For instance, I think even in McDonald's bread, there's sugar, right? Things that kind of encourage us to overeat, overconsumption. They have deceptive labeling, see on the right of the slide, right? And they said like, okay, one way to eat healthy is like one thing to stick it to the man. One way to kind of shake off this manipulative practices is to eat healthy. That's the thing you can do. Now, eating healthy becomes an act of autonomy, an act of taking back control over your own life. And eating fast food is basically being a victim of manipulative practices. So here they tap into this desire to autonomy. And then second, they also emphasize social justice, right? I think, as you know, fast food companies often target poor people and very young children, right? What they're trying to do is exploit the people who have are somewhat weaker and trying to get their manipulative tactics, especially to work there. So now what they want to try is to, instead of telling them what healthy eating is and what they should do, they say, oh, look, this is how they manipulate them. And what you can see here, and per usual, I'm running a bit low on time, so I kind of go quickly through it. But you can see that in this kind of expose treatment, there's always the children in that they drink less unhealthy food. They choose less unhealthy drinks. They choose less unhealthy food options. In these conditions. So even without explicitly telling them, oh, you should have this choice over that choice. No, by telling them you're getting manipulated and controlled, that decreases the likelihood that they fall for these unhealthy choices. So it's a very different approach, but that respects the needs teenagers have. And I think it's like a really cool study, I think, that you can apply to many different contexts where media tries to manipulate us to believe certain things, and it works very well with teenagers. In the last bit, I want to talk a little bit about basically psychological needs. So before I kind of highlighted it, that certain age groups have stronger needs. So teenagers have a stronger sense for autonomy than, for instance, elementary school children, right? The idea of psychological needs is that you and we all have the same needs. To a certain degree, what we want to do, what motivates us, what makes us happy, if we are autonomous, if we feel a sense of relatedness and a sense of competence. Okay, so this is the other part of self-determination theory by DC and Ryan, where they say like, okay, instead of thinking about individual differences, if your intervention addresses and respects these three components, then you will successfully change people's behavior. Okay, So I think let me go through them once and then kind of relate them to an intervention. So autonomy, we talked about is, it's a little bit confusing because autonomy almost sounds like intrinsic motivation. But here the idea is that every activity can either be kind of like be controlled or can be initiated from within, right? And there are certain degrees to that. You can think about my example with giving this lecture here, right? Within this giving this lecture, I have to give this lecture, but I can design, for instance, the slide how I want. I can talk about the content that I want. I can talk about it in a way that I want. I don't have to be concerned with the impression that, for instance, my line manager would have of these slides. This is a freedom and a sense of autonomy that I experience in my daily life that most people in their jobs do not have, right? So that's a sense of autonomy. Relatedness is, or this is competence. Competence is something, it's obvious, but what people want to know is there are two aspects. You want to have a sense of growing, of exerting influence, being effective when handling the world around us, when handling your problems, right? So what you want to experience is a sense of competence, but you also want to be recognized as a person of competence by others, okay? So if I basically come to you and tell you, oh, you know what, you're eating unhealthy, let me tell you how to eat healthier, then maybe this might also kind of undermine my sense of competence, not only my sense of autonomy, but I feel like, well, what does that person think, how stupid I am? Okay. Relatedness in some ways, again, is kind of like obvious. Like one of our key concerns is, I think we talk in social psychology a ton about this, but we want to feel that we are related in meaningful ways, that we belong in a context to a group. And we also want to feel like we're a respected, valued member of our team, of our group, of our community. So there are these two aspects, okay? So now let's apply them and think a little bit about when, like for instance, here's like one example. What makes it like if a person helps another person, how can we think about that in terms of these three needs, okay? So in Netta Weinstein and colleagues in this article cited below, they kind of distinguish between these two different types of helping, right? Controlled help and autonomous help. So if the helper is basically helping another person because they want to maintain self-esteem, they want to please others or want to obey demands or any kind of external reward, then what they do is they help, but it's a controlled help. And autonomous help would be one that's emanating from from basically congruent with oneself's values and interest and experience of choice. So I would say like, I want to help you, not I don't have to help you, right? So you can kind of see there are these two different types of helping. The behavior on the surface is the same. But the idea would be basically that for autonomous help, it's much more beneficial to the person helping. If you feel like that the pro-social actions that you choose are freely and like basically freely chosen and they're aligned with your values, then you will feel much more satisfied when you help another person. But if it's control help, if you do not feel that you own the helping act, right, then this will decrease the satisfaction of helping. And you might do it because others would get mad at me if I didn't, right? So if you, in the example with the bar exam, if I only help you because I think, ooh, if I don't help you, then she'll be mad at me, right? Or if I don't help you, then she'll tell my supervisor or whatnot, then I do controlled help. I don't experience autonomy and I will not feel happy about helping you. You can see the same with competence, right? Here, I think it's kind of obvious, but if you have a sense of autonomous help, this helps you to foster a sense of competence because you are basically addressing the world in a way that makes it more likely that you see a positive change that you're interested in. And so providing support for others increases self-efficacy, right? We often talk about this basically, if you freely help others, this is often much better for the person that helps than the person that is helped, right? So this is like advice giving is often better than advice receiving. The last one is relatedness. I mean, it's also kind of somewhat obvious, but the key here would be to say like, okay, if I'm autonomous in my help, then I can actually do it in a way that promotes my closeness to you, right? I kind of get positive responses for others. I do it freely, and I really think about how I could do it best. And if I do it in a controlled way, then often this might feel like, oh, she's just helping me because she has to. And so this will not really improve the relationship you and the other person have. And this kind of culminates to the sense that if I offer autonomous help, then I will be more motivated to offer that help, and the more motivated I am, the better the help will be. And I think this points back to a little bit, I think, what you guys said. Why does helping sometimes not help? Well, maybe the help is just really bad, right? So, but if you kind of are coming from an autonomous point of view, then your help will be more motivated. You will be have a higher motivation to do so. Your help will be better, and the recipient will also perceive it as better help, and hence will appreciate it more. So if you kind of come from the sense that, so in these studies, right, what you should try to do is try to help another person from an internal autonomous point of view, and not because you feel like you help. So when helping doesn't help is because it is controlled help and not autonomous help, at least in the framework of Netta Weinstein and colleagues. So here you see, okay, so if you kind of like, this is basically where they looked at this, they tested their framework. What you can see here, this is the autonomous help, and these are all kind of different well-being indicators. And here you see the helper and the recipient. And what you can see is that for the helper and the recipient, if the provided help is kind of rated by the giver as autonomous, then this has the most beneficial effect on the helper and the recipient on 3 different indicators of psychological well-being. So this kind of underscores what I just said, that basically providing help from an autonomous point of view is better for the helper, but also better for the recipient. Let me say one more thing, and this is kind of about trust. Another thing that's really important for teenagers is to receive respect and have a certain status. Here, I just want to highlight that DC and Ryan, for them, is like basically, oh, when are you respected by others? When you do an intervention, how can you make sure that the person that you address them feels like they are respected? And this is basically what they say, like, well, if you treat them as autonomous, competent people that have agencies and that have some kind of value to the group, then people will feel respected. Right? So you have to come from this kind of point of view, and then it is like, okay, how can I make sure if I offer help that the person feels respected? And this is basically by trying to treat them as if they have, treat them as autonomous people that are interested in relatedness and growth and agency, right? That's kind of, if you follow these principles, then people will much stronger respond to your intervention, especially if you do this with teenagers. There's a final example where they kind of integrate this into another version of the kind of like these 2 different types of eating interventions that I mentioned earlier. And one aspect that I just want to see is like here, and this is the last thing, right, that I want to say. If you look at the common features of traditional interventions, they treat people often as kind of a little bit stupid. They're not very high in competence. They're not really treated respectfully in these interventions, but rather talked down to and assumed little of their competencies of agencies. But if you have an intervention here on the right, where you kind of teach them more about how they get manipulated and let them make their own choices, this increases the respect you communicate. One last thing I just want to highlight is that here in these studies, they sometimes also include quotes from outraged high-status upperclassmen. because teenagers crave status. They look at how could we increase, how could we include messages from people that they perceive as higher status. This changes from group to group, and how can they basically support the meaning we are trying to establish. So there's another way you can kind of use status within your intervention to make sure that helps. Okay, here's another one. I think this is the last one that I want to, then I will end this. This is another, if you're interested in the Niall Boger study on his bar exams, they define this kind of idea of the invisible support. So you can basically help, ideally, it's a different approach for effective help, where the person that receives the help is not even aware that they get help. And that's another way to kind of have an effective way of doing an intervention. Okay, so I want to stop here. You can, yes, I want to stop here. This is a kind of like a little primer on how to keep the psychological needs of people in their mind when you do your intervention and when you do interventions, and why you might sometimes feel reactant if you're the recipient of interventions, and how kind of avoid these problems. Okay, I will stop the recording here. Happy to stay around if you have any questions or you want to chat with me, and we see most of you in the upcoming 2 days, I hope. I'm very excited about this. Okay, stay sane. Bye.